rather than giving some boring presentation about my latest working paper or something, I thought I'd give a couple of tips on writing empirical papers. These comments are partly based upon advice that I was given when I was an assistant professor by Harry DeAngelo, who's been at the University of Southern California now for many years, but was my colleague at Wharton for 2 years in my first job. And also some things that I'm finding that I'm constantly giving advice to authors when I write referee reports. And I keep a spreadsheet on how many referee reports I've written over the years, and it's approaching 600 right now. So, what Harry DeAngelo told me is you're fighting for the reader's attention. That in the title of the paper, you've got to convince them, why is it worth my time to read the abstract? And you don't have to get every reader's attention. If I see a title that says how to estimate the affine models of the term structure of interest rates, I know I don't want to read the abstract. But if you've got an interest in bond pricing, a title that's memorable helps you decide, should I read this or not? And then in the abstract, you've got to convince readers, why is it worth my valuable time to start reading the introduction? In the introduction, you've got to convince readers, why is it worth my valuable time to continue reading the paper? And in the conclusion, you've got to emphasize what's important that you're going to remember. And if there are 16 important points from the paper, it's an absolute guarantee that a week later, the reader will remember 0 out of 16. But if there's one thing that you emphasize in the abstract, in the introduction, in the conclusion, they might remember it. And so think about what's most important in your paper. And some papers, it's easier to figure this out than others. But also, when you're writing a paper, thinking about what's important can help you write a better paper. And if it's an empirical paper, very frequently you want to have 1 or 2 numbers that kind of summarize the economic importance of what's being found. So, shorter is better. Ask yourself how the paper could have more content per hour spent reading. And this has become a bigger problem over time. Many people have noted that if you go back to old papers like written 30 years ago, on average they're much shorter than papers published now. They're much easier to read. So, an article that's typically published now in one of the major journals, to read it carefully takes a full day or 2 of your time. And there just aren't that many readers who are so interested in your paper that they're willing to devote that much time. On the other hand, if you make it easier to read, it's more likely they'll keep on reading it. And let me, to some degree, you've got to fight the referees and editors on this. And if you are refereeing, you ought to think about not asking the author to do everything possible that you can think of, but to think about how can this paper be made more efficient for people to read. Unfortunately, most referees aren't doing that. But let me give you an extreme example. How many of you have read Michael Jensen's 1986 free cash flow paper? Most of us in corporate finance have certainly read it. As I recall, I think it's about 7 pages long. It was published in the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings issue. It did not go through the refereeing process. If it had, referee would have said, well, this paper has no empirical evidence to support this unsubstantiated assertion. This paper should be rejected, or there should be 30 pages of empirical work added so that it takes 8 hours for the person to read it, and it will be published 3 years from now. You know, what a good referee should have done, and almost certainly wouldn't have done, is said, hey, there's a really good idea here. It should get published as is. Now, Matt Spiegel, a couple of years ago, 2012, and I think I might have a slide on that as well, had an editorial in RFS after he was executive editor for 6 years, where I think it was called Reviewing Less. In any case, he was saying, you know, referees are asking too much of authors. The main question should be, is there an interesting new idea here? If so, it ought to get published. Now, that doesn't mean the referee can't make some suggestions on how to make it a better paper. But he said, you know, too many referees are asking an author to do way too much and diluting what's the central new idea in a paper. And you know, Mike Jensen's article I view as kind of the classic example of an idea, a simple idea, an important idea, and it only takes like an hour to read the paper, and much better value per hour than almost everything that I read, or even write. Now, of the papers that were presented this morning, there have not been bad examples of lots of tables that I see. But when you start thinking about the economic significance rather than statistical significance of coefficients, it forces you to start thinking about units of measurement. Like, is a return 0.003 or is it 0.3%? Well, if you're doing things in percentages, you can avoid having all these 0.00s in all these tables. When you start thinking about units of measurement, you sometimes realize, well, actually, in this table, I said I'm using millions, but I actually haven't used millions. When you force yourself to think about the economic significance, how do I interpret the economic effect of this coefficient, it's easy to catch those mistakes and correct them before you send out the paper to others. This is a paper I received last week. I haven't put the author's name there to avoid embarrassment. The paper, these are regressions, 7 regressions where the dependent variable is the first day returns on initial public offerings. Doesn't mention the units. Are these percentages or not percentage? No, he doesn't tell you, but when you start looking at these coefficients and t-statistics, it's obvious that he's got a 10% returns 0.1. And as a result, he's got all these 0.0s, including a coefficient of 0.000 with a t-statistic of 1.29. Now, what's more important, 3 non-zero digits for the t-statistic, or 0 digits for the point estimate? You know, if you're thinking about economic significance, you know, it's difficult to interpret 0 as anything but 0. You know, so just converting it to percentages would get rid of all sorts of 0.0s. And you know, this is extreme, But there are other coefficients where, like minus 0.004, only one non-zero digit, and when you're trying to interpret the economic significance of that, how, as the number of executive compensation reported, how many executives, is it 3 executives or 5 executives or 7 where their compensation is reported, multiplying it by that coefficient to think about economic significance, it starts to make you think about how have you measured things. Here we've got lagged revenues in thousands. Well, as a company goes from 1 million in sales to 1,000,000 in sales, he's assuming that the same effect is going from 10 billion in sales to 10 billion and 1,000. And I just wouldn't expect the same effect on underpricing of increasing your sales by 1,000 when you're at 1 million as when you're 10 billion. Any sensible empiricist would realize, well, probably the logarithm of revenues makes a lot more sense. And I would bet if that was used for both log revenue and log assets, not only would there be non-zero coefficients, but the t-statistics and the r-squared would be much better. But this is an extreme example of a really bad table. But in reviewing papers for conferences, for journals, all the time I see stuff like this. That's just so easy to fix. But if you're only thinking about statistical significance, it's easy to not think about the units of measurement. But if you start to think about economic significance, it forces you to think about the units of measurement. As I mentioned before, in the introduction and conclusion, whether it's a theoretical paper or an empirical paper, telling the reader 1 or 2 things to remember and emphasize as the central points of the paper gives you a much better chance of having the reader remember it a week later. Or, for that matter, when some other author cites your article. When you're reading other articles or in your own paper, when you're doing a literature review, how much time do you spend summarizing somebody else's work? Well, unless you're specifically criticizing their paper, most typically it's half a sentence is devoted to each other paper. And so if there's kind of one central point that they're making, one number that summarizes their paper, you might devote a full sentence to that paper, rather than just half a sentence saying, well, the following 13 papers have done related work. Now, many of us have already had the experience of receiving rejection letters after submitting things to journals. And many referee reports have mistakes in them. And it's easy to read the review, focus on the mistakes. Some of the times the reviewer did a real sloppy job. When I see a reviewer having made a mistake, misinterpreted something, I say, well, yeah, the reviewer was sloppy, but let me change the wording so the next reviewer finds it much more difficult to misinterpret what I meant to say. It's not at all unusual for me to realize, well, what I said is absolutely right. I knew what I meant, and this summarizes it, but the way I wrote it actually could have a different interpretation as well. And the reviewer was using this other interpretation where the way I wrote it was not inconsistent with that. I've got to rewrite it to make it clear that my interpretation is the only way to interpret it, not the other way. And you know, sometimes it's a little difficult to see that, rather than just saying the reviewer is wrong. Sometimes you've got to step back and say, well, how could the reviewer have thought that they were right? You know, on the other hand, some of the times they are just plain wrong, where they didn't understand things because they didn't put in much effort or they didn't know the related literature. But almost always it's worthwhile rewriting your paper to make it harder for the next reviewer to be making some of those same mistakes. And you don't have to pay attention to everything that a reviewer asks you to do. There are all sorts of situations where there's this way of doing it, that way of doing it. You know, one person might think one way is better than another, but it's not as if one is right and one is wrong. And it's kind of a judgment issue then. Well, is this other interpretation the better way of doing it? Or when I submit it to another journal, will I have wasted a lot of time putting in a lot of effort doing what that referee asked me to do, only to have the next referee tell me to what I had done originally before I changed it? I've gotten more cynical over time, and a lot of other experienced authors have as well, because there's too much arbitrariness in the reviewing process. Eva Welch just published an article in, I think it was the last issue of RFS. She actually got data from a number of journals and conferences about the reviews and rejections, revising, resubmits, etc., or for conferences where sometimes they ask reviewers to do numerical rankings of a paper. You know, the FMA does that. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the empirical evidence is that the correlation between two reviewers is distressingly low. That you can have a really good paper where one person gives it a 5, another person gives it a 1. There aren't that many papers that are really bad where both of the reviewers give it a score of 1, a really good paper where both reviewers give it a score of 5. There's a lot of noise in the process. There's more noise with conferences than with reviewing for journals, because at conferences, you know, I might be asked to review 10 papers. I've got no financial incentive to spend more than 5 minutes per paper. You know, typically what I do is I spend 5 minutes on each paper. Some I might read further, but if I read the abstract and say, yeah, this doesn't sound very interesting, I don't spend any more time on it. I once did, but eventually I figured out that what's in it for me, you know, if I was given financial incentives to do a more careful job, I might spend a little more time on it. But unfortunately, my behavior isn't too much different. In fact, it's better than a lot of the reviewers. You know, some reviewers just ask, well, is this a friend of mine or not? You know, you see this in terms of even at really selective conferences like the WFA, AFA. Most of the papers presented there never get published in one of the top journals. You know, because once reviewers read them carefully, they say, well, it's not that good a paper. You know, there's noise there. In Matt Spiegel's article, he said, you know, what if I did a controlled experiment? What if I took the papers that have been accepted by RFS and sent them to new reviewers? How many of them would I get back a report saying, hey, this is a really good paper, it should be published as is? He said, approximately 0% of the time that's going to occur. And more distressingly, a very big fraction of the time the reviewer would recommend rejecting the paper. And I don't see any reason to think he's wrong. After all, he had 6 years of experience dealing with hundreds and hundreds of papers. So he's not making this stuff up. There is arbitrariness there. But there's more than one journal. And if you do have a good paper, it's not very likely that time after time you're going to get a bad draw from the distribution. But when you do get a report back, you should look at it. And what I typically do is read it, get mad at stuff, and then think about it a couple of days later and ask myself, well, how, is this a valid objection or not? And a lot of the times I realize, my initial gut reaction was just hostility, that the referee's an obvious idiot. But, after thinking about it a little bit, there is some legitimacy to this complaint. And, is it worth a huge amount of effort to address it? Maybe, maybe not. You don't have to do everything a referee asks you to do. Even if you get a revise and resubmit, where you're going to be sending it back to the same referee, you don't automatically have to do everything that the referee asks you to do. In general, it's a bad strategy not to do a lot of the things. But the referee probably doesn't know everything as well as you do. And it's perfectly okay to say, well, you had 8 suggestions for me. I've done 6 of them just as you said. One of them, I disagree with you, and here's the logic for why I disagree. And this other one, you've got a reasonable point there, but it would just be so much effort to address that if you really want me to, I'll do it. But I just don't think the cost-benefit analysis is attractive enough. However, here's a suggestion as to why the results probably wouldn't change. It's okay to do something like that. But you shouldn't just automatically do everything a referee asks, and you shouldn't just reject out of hand what a referee is asking you to do if the paper got rejected. Because the better the suggestion is, the more likely it is that the next referee will have wanted you to do the same thing. And if you've already done it, the referee is much more likely to reject your paper than if you haven't done it. So, okay, I had mentioned Matt Spiegel's article. In his editorial, he also gave some suggestions. Said, introductions have gotten too long. Keep them shorter. And I think he's got a good point there. Now, not every paper is identical. Some should have longer introductions than others. But if the introduction is too long, the reader can get lost in terms of what's the central finding, what's important about this paper that's worth remembering. A number of journals are now asking papers to be explicitly limited, and increasingly adding internet appendices is becoming more common. There is an issue when you first submit a paper. If you don't have stuff in it, then a referee might say add it. But one thing to do is to focus on the paper in terms of try and keep it to 40 pages, including figures and tables and everything else, where you focused on the most important stuff, and rather than including all sorts of robustness tests in the main body of the paper, have a paragraph saying, and the appendices have a bunch of robustness tests. For refereeing, when you're refereeing, be honest. Don't try and guess what you think the editor wants you to say. Or if you're junior, or if you're not at a name brand institution, don't assume that editors are only sending you bad papers because they want you to reject them. The editor probably has read the abstract. The editor doesn't know whether it's a good or bad paper. If they knew it was a bad paper, they would just tell the author, I'm desk rejecting it. I don't want to waste a referee's time. It is the case that if you're a nobody, it's less likely that really important papers are going to be sent to you. But it's not automatic. There are some really good papers written by other people that don't already have brand name capital, and it might be sent to you. Or even if you don't have the brand name capital, an editor might still send it to somebody who's really well known, or even if you are very well known, send it to somebody who's not all that well known. Some of my best referees in recent years have been assistant professors, people who, and two separate papers, untenured faculty members gave me really insightful comments that made a paper better. 20 years ago, I had a doctoral student, Jim Davis, this was right after Fama and French published their cross-section of stock returns, and his dissertation paper at the University of Illinois was on the cross-section of stock returns, the pre-CompuStat evidence. And he submitted it to the Journal of Finance as a solely authored paper, and was very surprised when he got to revise and resubmit, where Gene Fama was the referee. Paper got accepted, and he was doing well in academics, but Ken French went out of his way to meet him and asked him, do you want to go work for Dimensional Fund Advisors instead? And he did, and his wallet is much fatter than it would have been if he had stayed in academics, and he does not regret that decision about having gone to work for DFA. One thing that I do when I write a referee's report is I always ask myself, how would I feel if I received this report? Even if I'm recommending rejection, would I feel that this is a fair report? Some of my reports are better than others, but I go out of my way to try and be honest, to ask, how would I feel if I was receiving this? And in particular, and this gets to the honesty point, if I don't think the topic is all that interesting, or it's just not making a big enough contribution to the literature, I say so. I say, look, even though I've made 8 suggestions for how the paper could be made better, and you could easily implement these things, I'm still recommending rejection for the judgment issue. On the other hand, there are other papers where I say, I'm not real excited about the paper, but maybe you can do something that would make it more exciting, and in which I might recommend a revise and resubmit. But I try and give the editor and sometimes the author some guidance in terms of, is this something that I think really has good potential? Is it a clear-cut rejection? Editors like to get truthful advice from referees. If you've got a strong opinion, let the editor know. If you're right on the borderline, let the editor know. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, I'm right on the borderline, and I don't know this literature well enough to be really confident about a decision. Why don't you send it to a second reviewer as well? And editors really like it if you can name potential other well-qualified reviewers. And like if it's an international corporate governance paper, saying that Andre Schleifer would be a well-qualified reviewer does not help an editor. They know that already. But naming a person who wouldn't be an obvious choice is something that an editor really likes. That doesn't mean the editor will necessarily send it to that person, but editors like to get suggestions of names of other people that you think would be very well qualified to evaluate that article. Also, I mentioned I've refereed almost 600 papers. I always do it in a timely manner. If I'm not going to do it in a timely manner, I just send an email back to the editor saying, sorry, I'm too busy this month. Here's the name of 2 other people that I think would be well qualified. And editors have told me that they much prefer that, especially if you give them some names of alternative people, rather than having a paper sit on somebody's desks for months. And by doing that, I keep myself from getting a big backlog and delaying other reports. If you look at the JFE website at the University of Rochester, about once a year they update who does the refereeing for them and the average turnaround time of each referee. And if you go to the associate editors list, you'll see some surprising results there, like Gene Fama takes an average of like 9 days to review articles. Before he won the Nobel Prize, he was quicker, but now he's a bit busier with other stuff. And he used to take an average of about 5 days. But when he gets a paper, he decides, am I going to review it this weekend and send in the report on Monday, or am I too busy? And he doesn't let things sit on his desk for months. I think that's a good policy, that if you're going to do it, do a good job, do it quickly, but don't use delay as a mechanism to signal to editors that you don't want them to send you more articles. It's a very inefficient way of doing it. Think about it. If you were the author, would you want the referee to be sitting on it for months as a way of signaling to the editor not to send me other papers in the future? Editors would much prefer that you just tell them right away, sorry, I'm too busy, or I don't want to do it. And once again, honesty is the best policy. If you don't ever want to review for that journal, tell the editor that. Especially journals that don't pay the referee, let the editor know, or if they don't pay enough. Indeed, in the past year, I turned down reviewing an article for the Journal of Finance, and I said, I can review articles for the JFE for $275. You're asking me to review this for $100. And, if I've got a choice, on a per hour basis, it's still not a lot of money. But if I've got a choice between $275 and $100, I can, spend the $175. I'm trying to get the Journal of Finance to boost their fees to referees, so far unsuccessfully. But the American Finance Association has assets of $12 million, and they're asking referees to volunteer their time so that they can continue to build up this massive war chest for no purpose. Just one of my pet peeves. I was an associate editor of the JF for 10 years. I've reviewed over 170 articles for them. I've done my share of service there. So in any case, some thoughts on writing and refereeing and how to respond to referees. I think I'm out of time here.